The dust of the high plains settled on everything, a fine red powder that clung to hope and choked it silent. It settled on the raw timber of the new town, on the sweat-slicked backs of horses, and on the girl tied to the hitching post in the center of the square. She was not a girl, not really, but her thinness made her seem so, like a fence rail waiting for a wire. Her dress was the color of a faded bruise, frayed at the hem where it met the cracked, bare skin of her feet. Her hair was a matted tangle, bleached by a sun that offered no kindness. She did not cry out. She did not beg. Her eyes were fixed on a space just past the worn boots of the men who gathered, a space that held nothing but heat, shimmer, and distance. The crowd was a restless animal, murmuring and shuffling. Voices, sharp as cracked glass, cut through the low hum. Spittle arced through the air and landed near her feet. She did not flinch. It was as if she had hollowed herself out, leaving only a shell for their contempt to echo in. At the edge of the crowd, a man named Brand preened. He was the one who had tied the rope, his movements practiced and proprietary. He saw her not as a person but as a problem he was cleverly solving, turning a burden into a few coins or a bottle of whiskey. He spoke of her as if she were a lame horse, a piece of faulty equipment. Then another man appeared, separating himself from the heat haze at the edge of town. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy that spoke of fatigue bone deep. His duster was the color of the earth, his boots scuffed and gray with travel. His name was Silas, and he carried whole winters in his eyes. He was a widower, a man whose silence had grown over him like moss on a stone, and he had come to town for salt and flour, not for this. He stopped, his gaze falling on the woman at the post. He saw the coarse rope biting into her wrists, the vacant geography of her stare. And in that moment he was not in this dusty town square. He was 10 years gone, on a different patch of sun-scorched earth, finding a small body half-buried in the sand. An Apache child, left behind or lost, whose silent, accusing eyes had haunted him ever since. He had been too late then. The child's stillness had been permanent, a question he could never answer. He looked back at the woman, at the life still flickering dimly within her. A muscle worked in his jaw. The ghost of the child stood beside him, its small shadow falling over his heart. He could not be too late again. Brand was starting his pitch, his voice oily and loud. What am I bid for this stray? Strong back if you can get her to use it. Quiet. I'll give her that. Laughter, rough and careless, answered him. Silas moved forward. The crowd parted for him, sensing a shift in the air. He did not raise his voice. He did not glower. He simply walked until he stood before Brand, his shadow falling over the woman on the ground. I'll take her, Silas said. His voice was low, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards, and used to the open air. Brand squinted, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Silas, didn't figure you for this kind of sport, he gestured to the woman. She's worth a silver dollar at least. Silas's gaze did not waver. You owe me 5 for that fence mending last spring. That was a friendly turn, Brand protested, his bluster fading. And this is me collecting, Silas stated. It was not a negotiation. He reached into his duster, his hand emerging not with coin, but with a small, sharp pocketknife. The blade clicked open, a sound that cut through the murmuring and silenced it completely. He knelt. The woman flinched, a tremor that ran through her whole body, the first sign of life she had shown. He did not look at her face. He looked at the ropes. With 2 swift, clean motions he sliced through the fibers. The bonds fell away from her wrists, leaving raw, red marks behind. He folded the knife and stood, stepping back to give her space. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak a word of comfort. He simply waited. For a long moment, she remained on the ground, her hands still held in front of her as if the ropes were ghosts. Then, slowly, she lowered them. She looked at her freed wrists, then up at the silent man standing over her. His face was a mask of weathered stone, but his eyes held something other than contempt. It was not pity. It was something quieter, harder to name. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she followed. She pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, weak from disuse. The crowd watched, their curiosity soured with a vague disappointment. The show was over. The woman, the object of their scorn, took one hesitant step, then another, following the broad, retreating back of the man who had claimed her with a debt and a knife. The journey to his homestead was a long stretch of silence. The land was vast and unforgiving, a palette of brown and ochre under a pale, bleached sky. The wind was a constant companion, whispering of loneliness. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of their own footprints. Silas walked ahead, his pace steady and slow, measured for legs weaker than his own. He never looked back, but she knew he was aware of her, of the soft, shuffling sound of her bare feet on the hard-packed earth. Once, he stopped and unhooked the canteen from his belt. He set it on a rock, then walked on a dozen paces before stopping again, his back to her. She approached the canteen as a wild thing might approach a salt lick. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. The water was warm from the sun, but it was the first true kindness she had known in a time she could no longer measure. She drank, the water a shock of life in her dry throat, then carefully replaced the cap and set it back on the rock. She caught up to him and they walked on. His home appeared on the horizon not as a promise, but as a simple fact. It was a small, solid cabin of hewn logs, chinked with mud and weathered to a silver gray. It stood alone, with a tired-looking barn and a web of fences that seemed to be stitching the land together with raw thread. A single, lonely cottonwood tree stood guard, its leaves whispering to the wind. On a low hill overlooking the cabin, there was a small mound of stones, marked with a simple wooden cross. The cabin door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, leaving it open for her. The air within was cool and smelled of wood smoke, dust, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of lavender and absence. The main room was sparse. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few tins and a leather-bound book. Everything was clean, ordered, and profoundly empty. It was the home of a man who did not live so much as he existed. He gestured toward a closed door. "That room is yours." Then he pointed to the pump outside. "Water to the shelves. Food," he looked at her then, his gaze direct for the first time since the town square. "I don't lock doors." The unspoken contract settled in the space between them. Food, shelter, safety. Nothing more was offered. Nothing more was asked. She went into the room. It was even more Spartan than the main one. A simple cot with a clean, patched blanket. A small window looking out toward the grave on the hill. The room felt scrubbed clean of a former life, its memories packed away or burned. She sat on the edge of the cot, the straw mattress rustling beneath her slight weight. For the first time in an age, she was behind a door that was not locked. She listened to the sounds of the man moving in the other room, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a tin cup. They were the sounds of a life, however quiet. She did not know what this place was, but it was not a cage. And for now that was enough. She lay back on the cot, pulled the rough blanket over her, and fell into a sleep so deep it was like falling into the earth itself. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. A routine began to form, unspoken and unguided. Silas would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm clock. He would work the land, a solitary figure moving against the vast horizon, mending fences, tending to his 2 horses and a handful of scrawny chickens. She started small. At first, she just stayed in her room, a ghost in his house. Then, one morning, she took the broom from its corner and swept the floor. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. She swept the dust and the grit from the boards until the wood shone, pale and clean. When Silas came in for his midday meal, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the clean floor. He said nothing. He simply removed his dusty boots before stepping inside, a silent acknowledgement that settled between them like a held breath. She began to cook. The first meal was a disaster. She found flour and salt, but her hands were clumsy, her memory of such things buried under layers of trauma. The bread she pulled from the hearth oven was a dense, smoky rock. She set it on the table between them, her cheeks burning with shame. Silas sat down. He picked up the loaf, weighed it in his hand, and broke a piece off with a loud crack. He chewed it thoughtfully for a moment. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice flat. Tears pricked her eyes. She flinched, expecting a blow or a curse. He just looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He broke off another piece. The next day, he left a small sack of yeast on the table. When she tried again, he stood by the hearth, not speaking, but guiding her with small gestures. A nod toward the water, a motion with his hand to show her how to knead the dough until it was pliant and alive. That evening, they ate warm, soft bread, and the silence at the table was less a void and more a shared space. She found a rhythm in the work. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat. She tended the small patch of withered vegetables behind the cabin, coaxing green life from the dry soil. The work was a balm, a way to reclaim her own hands, to prove they were for creating and tending, not just for being bound. One afternoon, while weeding, she found a single, stubborn wildflower, a splash of defiant blue against the brown earth. On impulse, she picked it. She walked up the low hill to the grave with its wooden cross. The name Anna was carved into the wood, the letters softened by wind and rain. She knelt and gently pushed the stem of the wildflower into the packed earth at the base of the cross. She did not know Anna, but she knew loss. It was a language they both spoke. From the barn door, Silas watched her. He saw the small offering, the bowed head. He felt a sharp, unexpected pang in his chest, a thawing around a part of his heart he thought had frozen solid long ago. His wife had loved wildflowers. He turned back to his work, the feel of the rough harness leather in his hands a grounding reality. The house began to change in small, incremental ways. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a place where two separate solitudes learned to coexist. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would hum, a low, tuneless sound that filled the corners of the quiet room. At first, the sound made him tense, an intrusion. But soon, he found it was a sound that stitched the silence together, making it whole. He, in turn, offered his own quiet cares. He noticed her shivering in the cool evenings and left a thick, wool blanket folded on her cot, one he had packed away in a chest long ago. He saw her struggling with a broken handle on the water pump and, without a word, spent the next morning taking it apart and fixing it, the clang of his hammer on metal a kind of conversation. The neighbors, the few souls scattered across the miles, were a distant curiosity. They had seen him return with the woman. Tongues wagged in town. One day, a man named Peters, whose land bordered Silas's, rode over. He saw her hanging laundry on a line she had fashioned from rope and two saplings. "Silas," Peters said, his eyes flicking from the woman back to Silas. "Heard you bought yourself some help." The words were laced with insinuation. Silas didn't stop sharpening his axe. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound for a long moment. "I didn't buy anything," he said, his voice level and cold. "I paid a debt." "Looks like a debt that keeps on giving," Peters smirked. Silas set the axe down. He turned his full attention to the man. His eyes were flat and hard as river stones. "She's under my roof, Peters. That makes her my concern. Not yours. Not the town's." "Mine." Peters's smirk vanished. He saw the line that had been drawn in the dust. He muttered something about the weather and rode off. Later, when she brought him a cup of water, her eyes met his. In them he saw not fear, but a flicker of something else. Gratitude, understanding. She knew he had defended her honor, an honor she thought had been stripped from her and left for dead in a town square. The first real crack in the silence came on a night when the wind turned mean, rattling the windows and clawing at the roof. She woke up from a nightmare, a strangled cry escaping her lips before she could stifle it. The dream was always the same. The rough rope, the laughing faces, the feeling of being less than human. She sat bolt upright on her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was dark, save for the faint orange glow of dying embers in the hearth. She heard a soft creak of floorboards outside her door. He was there, standing vigil. He didn't try the door. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent presence holding back the darkness. The fear receded, replaced by a profound sense of safety. The next morning, the air was thick with unspoken things. As they sat at the table, the quiet felt different, heavier. She looked at her hands, resting on the worn wood of the table. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was a thin, rusted thing, creaking from disuse. It was the first question she had ever asked him. Silas looked up from his cup. He knew what she was asking. Why her? Why bother? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He stared into the fire, but his eyes were seeing something else, a landscape of memory. "Years ago," he began, his voice low and rough, "I was tracking strays up near the canyons, found a child, Apache girl, maybe 4, 5 years old." He paused, swallowing. "She was alone, the sun. She was gone. Nothing I could do, just dig a hole, say some words to a God I wasn't sure I believed in." He looked at her then, and his eyes were filled with the vast, empty sorrow of that memory. "When I saw you, tied up there, I saw her. I was too late for her. I wasn't going to be too late again." The confession hung in the air between them. It was not a declaration of affection, but an explanation of a haunting. She understood. He had not saved her out of kindness for her, but out of a debt to a ghost. Yet, in that shared understanding of loss, a new, fragile bond was forged. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a second before lightly touching the back of his calloused hand on the table. It was a fleeting touch, light as a falling leaf, but in the quiet cabin, it landed with the weight of a vow. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over, his palm facing up, an unspoken invitation in a world they were building together, one small gesture at a time. The fragile piece they had cultivated was as delicate as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. The harbinger of its destruction came not as a letter or a rider, but as a plume of smoke on the horizon, dark and oily against the clear blue sky. It rose from the direction of the south pasture, where the grass was driest. Silas saw it from the barn. He dropped the pitchfork and ran, his long legs eating up the ground. The woman came out of the cabin, a hand to her brow, her face tight with a new and familiar fear. This was not an accident. This was a message. By the time he reached the fire, a significant patch of his grazing land was a blackened, hissing scar. He beat at the edges with a wet sack, his face grim, the smoke stinging his eyes. She was right behind him, her movements swift and sure, her small frame surprisingly strong as she mirrored his actions. They worked in a desperate, silent unison, two figures battling a blaze that felt like a personal violation. They did not save the pasture, but they stopped the fire from reaching the barn. They stood at the edge of the blackened earth, chests heaving, faces smeared with soot. The smell of scorched grass hung heavy in the air. This was the work of Brand. A reminder, a threat. He came 3 days later, not alone. He brought 2 hired men with him, men with hard, empty eyes and guns holstered low on their hips. They rode their horses right up to the cabin, trampling the small vegetable patch she had worked so hard to nurture. The sight of the crushed plants sent a sharp pain through her chest, as if they were her own bones. Brand dismounted, his boots crunching on the soil. He looked different here, smaller and uglier against the vast, honest landscape. "Silas," he called out, his voice carrying an artificial confidence. "I've come for my property." Silas emerged from the cabin, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He did not point it. He did not need to. His presence was enough. "She's not property, Brand, and she's not yours." "I have a bill of sale," Brand lied, patting his chest pocket. "Signed by the magistrate in Willow Creek. She belongs to me. You were just holding her. Now the holding is over. His gaze slid past Silas to where the woman stood in the doorway, half hidden in the shadows. Come on out, girl. Time to go. The woman's heart seized. The old fear, cold and paralyzing, threatened to pull her under. She could feel the ghost of the rope on her wrists. The world shrank to the size of Brand's cruel smirk and the two men beside him. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear back into the silent, hollowed-out person she had been. But then she looked at Silas. He stood between her and them, a solid, unmoving wall of quiet defiance. He was not a big man, not a gunslinger, but there was an unyielding strength in his stance. He was protecting this place, their place. He was protecting her. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, a cold stone in her gut, but something else rose up to meet it. A slow, hot anger, an indignation that was entirely her own. She had swept this floor. She had baked this bread. She had coaxed life from this soil. She had placed a flower on Anna's grave. This was her home. She stepped out of the shadows and into the sunlight, moving to stand beside Silas. Her hands were empty, her frame slight, but her chin was up. Her eyes, clear and direct, met Brand's. I belong to no one, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the yard with the force of a thrown stone. It was steady. It was firm. It was the voice of a person, not an object. Brand's smirk faltered. He had expected a cowering animal. He was not prepared for this. You don't get a say in it, he snarled, his bravado cracking. Now get over here before I have my boys drag you. Silas shifted his weight, the shotgun seeming to grow heavier in his arm. You'll have to come through me, he said, his voice dangerously low. And I don't think you want to do that. The two hired men exchanged a nervous glance. This wasn't the easy job they'd been paid for. They were hired to intimidate a lone man and retrieve a broken woman, not to get into a shooting war over a patch of dirt and a principle. They saw the look in Silas's eyes, the same look of a cornered coyote, ready to fight to the death. They saw the woman beside him, her face a mask of fierce resolve. They were not fighting for property. They were fighting for a home. Brand saw it too. He was a bully, and the first instinct of a bully when faced with true resistance is to fold. His bluster evaporated, leaving behind a petty, whining anger. He spat on the ground. She's not worth dying for, Silas. You'll regret this. The only thing I'd regret is letting you take her, Silas replied, his voice flat and final. With a final curse, Brand mounted his horse. His men, visibly relieved, were already turning to leave. He gave the two of them one last look of pure hatred, then spurred his horse and galloped away, his posse trailing behind him like a dirty secret. They stood there, Silas and the woman, watching the dust settle, the trampled garden, the scorched earth, the lingering tension in the air. The threat was gone. They were alone again. The silence that descended was different from any that had come before. It was not empty or awkward. It was a shared territory earned and defended. Silas finally lowered the shotgun. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. You hurt? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. She shook her head, though she was trembling from head to foot. No, she looked at him, at the quiet strength that had been her shield. You didn't run. Neither did you, he said. A small, sad smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. He took a half-step closer, and for the first time, he reached out and laid his hand on her shoulder. The touch was not possessive, not demanding. It was firm, grounding, a recognition, an affirmation. In that quiet moment, with the smell of smoke and dust in the air, they were no longer a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were a fortress of two. In the days that followed the confrontation, the very air in the cabin seemed to have been respun, woven into something stronger, more resilient. The unspoken contract of food and shelter was gone, replaced by an unspoken partnership. They worked to erase the scars Brand had left, their movements falling into an easy, synchronous rhythm. Together, They repaired the fence where the horses had trampled it, their hands often brushing as they passed tools back and forth. Together, they tilled the ruined garden, turning over the wounded soil to prepare it for a new planting. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls, Silas looked at her. He had been calling her woman in his mind, a label that now felt coarse and wrong. She was the person who stood beside him, who faced down his enemies, who brought life back into the hollow spaces of his home and his heart. "I don't know your name," he said quietly into the crackling silence. She looked into the fire, her past a landscape of smoke and ash. The name she had been born with was a brand, seared onto her by a life she wanted to forget. It belonged to the girl tied to the post, the object of scorn. That girl was gone, burned away in the fire of defiance. "I don't have one I wish to keep," she answered, her voice soft. Silas considered this for a long moment. He thought of new beginnings, of the stubborn wildflower she had placed on Anna's grave, of the light she had brought back into his life without ever trying. "Lena," he said. The name felt right on his tongue. "It means light." She tested the name in the quiet of her own mind. Lena. It was a clean name, a new name. It belonged to the woman who baked bread and stood her ground. It was a gift, and she accepted it. She looked at him and nodded. A small, slow movement that was more powerful than any words. A smile, real and unburdened, touched her lips for the first time. "Lena," she repeated. It was the sound of a seed sprouting in scorched earth. The next day, she took the ragged, bruised-colored dress she had arrived in, the one she had kept folded at the bottom of a chest. She carried it out to the fire pit. Silas followed, watching as she dropped the garment onto the cold ashes. He struck a match and tossed it onto the cloth. The fabric caught, curling and blackening, the past turning to smoke and rising into the vast, open sky. They watched until it was nothing but a memory. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Their life settled into a new kind of peace, a quiet orbit of two stars that had found their center. The house, once haunted by absence, now breathed. It was filled with the smell of baking bread, the sound of a low hum, the quiet scrape of two chairs at a table. The silence was no longer a void but a comfortable blanket they shared. Years fell away like autumn leaves. The land healed, and so did they. They never spoke of love, for the word was too small for what they had built. They had forged their bond from sterner stuff: mutual respect, shared labor, and the quiet, fierce loyalty of survivors. Theirs was a love built not on declarations, but on the daily act of mending what was broken, in the world and in each other. They never had children of their own, but their home became a sanctuary. They took in a boy who had run away from a cruel apprenticeship, and later, a family whose farm had been washed away in a flash flood. Their small, two-person fortress expanded, their found family a testament to the idea that a home is not built of wood and stone, but of open doors and second chances. The final image is one of twilight. Silas and Lena, their hair now streaked with silver, sat on the porch they had built together. The wood was smooth and worn beneath their hands. They watched the sun bleed a final, blood-orange farewell across the horizon, painting the land they had defended and nurtured in hues of fire and peace. The boy they had raised, now a man himself, was telling a story to his own child by the barn, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The house behind them was warm, its windows glowing with light. It breathed with the slow, deep rhythm of a sleeping giant, content and full of life. They did not speak. They did not need to. They simply sat, together, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky, two solitudes that had found their way home to each other. This story, it is not just about a rescue in a dusty town. It is about the quiet courage it takes to claim a soul when the world has discarded it. It is about the power that lies not in ownership, but in the giving of a name, the offering of a choice. Every life has a moment it is tied to a post, judged by a crowd, and left for worthless. We are all, at some point, that figure in the dust, waiting. And so here is your naming. It is the hope that when you are found, It is by hands that do not wish to bind you further, but to cut the ropes. It is the hope that you will find the strength to step out of the shadows and claim your own voice. The world is full of empty houses and lonely souls. But if you are brave enough to offer a piece of bread, to defend a patch of ground, to see the person instead of the property, you might just find that you are not building a shelter for another. You are finally, truly, building a home for yourself.